created quite a consternation amongst many corporate based companies in Georgia. They don't like what the Republican legislature did, and they put some pressure on Major League Baseball, or Major League Baseball succumbed to pressure, and they decided they were going to move the All Star game and the baseball draft from Georgia coming up in mid July. This specific measure, you probably have heard about it, but I want to just take a moment here to give you some specifics about it. The Georgia measure will give the state's Republican majority legislature more control over county election boards, which certify elections. It also adds voter ID requirements for absentee ballots, and that seems to upset many, many people, the requirement for the photo ID or the voter ID. It limits access to ballot drop boxes while codifying them into state law. These are the drop boxes where you drop your ballots off in advance of the election. It expands early voting days for the general election, which most people seem to think is a good idea. I don't know how that would keep people from voting. It criminalizes the practice of line warming, in which volunteers hand out food and water to voters standing in long lines. Now, virtually every state has that. There's a thing called electioneering. You're not supposed to do it within 150 feet, generally speaking, of the polling place. And again, the concern was, I guess, last time there were some political organizations who had an axe to grind, and they were handing out water and or food to people that were waiting in line. That's called electioneering. That literally is illegal in virtually every state. Now, this is the provision that probably has got the most national reaction. They say, well, how on earth, why would you not give water to someone who's standing in line? Well, if the water bottle that you're handing out has a label that says vote for, Governor Kemp or vote for Stacey Abrams, then that's a political document. That's like getting a pamphlet. So there's a reason why Georgia would not want someone from a political persuasion to be giving water out. But again, the broader thing is we don't want anybody to do it. It does not prohibit the county itself from giving out water. So an entity can do it as long as it's not a partisan entity. And again, that's a delineation or a difference in the specifics of the law that no one is promoting. It certainly at the national level, it's being wrapped up into this joke that someone who's starving and dying of thirst can't get water while they're waiting in line. That's not exactly right. It shortens the runoff elections and all but eliminates the use of mobile voting buses, barring emergencies, and these are among the other rules. And again, this is something that the governor has responded to. I think one of the reasons why there has been this overwhelming response to what Georgia has done is that Georgia is the first state to have changed some of their voting laws. There are other states, mostly Republican states, that want to change their voting laws as well to match some of these recommendations of Georgia. And because of that, there is great fear that this is going to be a national, there's going to be a run on this type of election in other states. And so the corporate titans that rest in Georgia, they want to use as much power as they can to punish the state of Georgia and its legislators for doing what at least many Republican lawmakers believe is just making the elections more fair in their states. Ray Hanania, back to you. I spent a little more time than I wanted necessarily laying it all out, but I think since newscasts never do that, I'm wondering if you think this is just an example that the national news media is just deliberately misrepresenting the specifics of this legislation to make their political point.
I think there's a movement in the Democratic Party, the far left. I hate to use labels like that, but these are people that are uncompromising. They don't support consensus. They found that you could use race to pretty much drive any issue. I think that if people were to debate what Atlanta is or what Georgia is doing, debate the issue of ID cards. I can't imagine any Arab not having an ID card. So, are they being discriminated against? And any person, a citizen, not having an ID card, not having access to an ID card, what is that about? And when you address it that way, it doesn't seem logical. The arguments against this, but when you put the color of race on it, you beat people up and say you're a racist if you oppose it,
But
you're a racist if you support it. Then it changes the whole argument. You can't get into the real
Anthony,
issues.
isn't the crux of what Ray just said is that you have people arguing this point who try to make the point that African Americans are not smart enough to know where to go to get an ID.
Yes,
I
and that's my point. That's my point exactly. And then I think what most people need to also understand is this: there was a huge percentage of Americans last year, during last year's elections, national elections, that have some shortcomings about that election. And so some of us want to address those issues so that during the next election cycle,
Right.
we won't have these issues. And if they would come across like that, in addition to these small these infantile measures that are being taken in order to ensure election integrity. I mean, what else could a person ask for in a free country? Everyone wants free and fair elections, no matter what the race is.
But is it also, but realistic, Paul? Isn't this a fault of the Republicans and those that support this legislation, that they have not been out front to explain to the media and go on camera and explain what this water, waiting in line is all about? That it's not just some punitive decision, but there's some reason for it.
Look, there's going to be a lot of states that are going to be taking a look at their voting laws post-COVID, because COVID was a game changer when it came to voting absentee and the drop boxes and things like that. And remember, every state controls their own local voting laws. I mean, you want to talk about voting suppression? Illinois, for crying out loud.
You know something about
you really
that.
think about it. I remember how horrified the people in the city were when I was a school board, when I was school superintendent, when we pushed to require all of our high schoolers who were graduating, who were 18, to also be registered to vote. So at the end of the day, there's been voter suppression on the left and voter suppression on the right. I do want to say a couple of things though. Number one, this isn't Jim Crow 2. That's hyperbole and that's offensive. And the fact that they would say that is clearly they're trying to politicize this.
That's the president. That's the president of the United States playing that race card in his right. We do have to pause. We'll be back in just a moment. One last segment.
All right.
Bruce DuMont back in Evanston, Illinois with Beyond the Beltway this evening. And let's go to Dave, who's listening to us in Spokane, Washington, where I'm sure the partying continues in the city that welcomes and calls home probably Gonzaga, who tomorrow night's going to go for the National NCAA Championship against Baylor. It's going to be one heck of a basketball game, but the game last night was probably one of the great basketball games of all time. And again, I was cheering like millions of other fans all over the country. Dave, is the city, is it still rocking tonight?
We're still rocking. We can all together say, "Go Zags!
Yes.
Go Zags!"
Yes.
I just hope that they don't give me a heart attack.
Well, that game
they were
last
trying to give me a heart attack in the last game.
Yeah, that last game was quite something. The buzzer beater, literally with no time left. That's the way to win. That's the way to get everybody's attention. But how can we help you tonight?
Yeah, we'll see how it goes tomorrow. But
okay.
Hey, I want to say you hit it exactly. I always love that you are right on these things. With the electioneering, that's the problem. Not specifically in Georgia that I'm talking about. If I wanted to go into a long line of people just with regular clothing and not say a word to people about my political leanings one way or the other, I could walk up and down that line and hand out water all day, and I'm not going to be in any kind of problems. The law specifically addresses you can't be a political advocate. trying to do
Right.
what you mentioned, electioneering. And then I feel like we're in the twilight zone in America in regards to so many things. But this, for example, you have these companies and the Major League Baseball and different sports athletes coming out and raising hay about a Georgia law, which, quite frankly, they don't even understand the law, and they're all upset about something. They don't even know the facts.
Right.
But yet you don't hear the uproar about H.R. 1 in the House of Representatives, and it's completely it's a dichotomy of where we should be. We should absolutely be more concerned about H.R. 1 in the House of Representatives, a law that they're trying to pass that would actually get rid of the requirement for IDs,
Yes.
get rid of signature verification. They're trying to register everybody under the sun. I mean, it just seems so ridiculous that the outrage is totally in the wrong area.
Well, this
and
is
as far
why
as the
this
ID
is
that
what
you guys were talking
this is what
Okay.
surprises me, and I want to get your reaction, Dave, but I want to get our guests online as well. And I'm going to start with Paul Vallis. Paul, why is it when you look at the logos of the 15 to 20 companies, they're not all just Atlanta based. Most of them are, but many of them are not. It includes Facebook and Apple and many others. Why do you think they jump into this? I mean, clearly they know that their stockholders, some of their stockholders will agree with this law. Some of them will disagree with it. Some will read race issue into it. Some will, can't see race into this legislation. And yet, as a corporation, they step up to support a political position that many people disagree with. And yet they're putting their logos on the line. Why do you think they do that?
Well, I think the narrative has been really the narrative has been one of voter suppression. This is the narrative has been one of local empowerment, institutional racism, etc. I think that's been the narrative, and I think what they're trying to do. I mean, the same way the NFL switched from a point where they, in effect, ostracized Kaepernick to the point to where they were suddenly embracing Black Lives Matter and many of the other advocate groups, many of the other groups that were basically trying to make the case about institutional racism in the country. I think what these corporations
do they lose money over it? But do you think they lose money?
Marketing.
Do you think they lose money over it though?
Well,
I mean, are they doing something that they think they're going to get some social attaboys for the national media? But the reality is, in the corporation, maybe they're losing money.
That's hard to say. I can't tell you what goes on behind closed doors, but I think whether it's Major League Baseball or, for that matter, I pointed out the NBA, the way they were silent on China's suppression of Hong Kong,
right?
In part because of their massive Chinese market. I think these corporations are driven by the profit motive, and they kind of assess where things should fall, and or where they're what posturing they should embrace that will protect their market. And I think that's what you're seeing now. And until there's a backlash, I think you're going to continue to see them move in that direction. Of course, you're all aware of the controversial Pepsi commercial where you basically have a multiracial, multi-ethnic group of protesters confronting police. Yeah. And of course, it's someone walks through the crowd. I think it was one of the Kardashians or one of the Jenner daughters, walks through the crowd and kind of breaks the ice by giving a police officer a can of Pepsi. So I mean, it's just this is all market driven. They're looking at where their profits
I want to
are.
get Ray and Anthony. Ray, how do you? And I didn't ask anybody before the program whether you're going to boycott any of these companies. I mean, certainly the Major League Baseball is President Trump has said that people should boycott Major League Baseball. I don't know how that really demonstrates itself, but are there any of these other companies that you think are going to lose much sleep or much money, by taking this position, like an Apple?
I don't think these companies are going to lose any sleep, Bruce, for one reason. One fact is this: they have a large footprint in a bunch of these communities, and so therefore they're trying to placate these different communities, whether it means whether they will adversely affect them or not. They want to be seen as taking the high road, the moral road, in terms of having this relationship with the African American community at large, and everything else be damned. That's their position.
Is it all? But I guess my question is: it all about the black market, that they're only concerned about
I don't
appeasing
think they're
black
concerned about.
consumers?
I don't think they're concerned too much about the black market. But as you can see, once you get a label, it's sort of hard to shake those labels. I mean, look at how hard it's been for the Republican Party in general to
Yeah.
shake the label of being racist, no matter what.
Right.
They've got that, they can't seem to shake it. And it's been generations and nothing's changed. And so once you get those labels, it's hard to lose them, especially in today's environment where news travels fast. There's social media,
Okay,
and there's different platforms.
Ray,
It fast.
I want to ask Ray. Ray, as a journalist, because you referenced the narrative, and Paul has talked about, that companies, that they've bought into a narrative, or they become captive of a narrative. How does a narrative begin? Because if you have the media on one hand and you have corporate America on the other, how does that start? Who starts that narrative?
It used to be that we would have elected officials, government officials elected by the people, set the tone, decide what the issues are. I'm telling you, the news media, which is corporate run, major media, I'm not talking about the small press, the community press. I'm talking about major media. They define things. This is a big story for them. They're making more money. When an African American is killed in Chicago, they sell newspapers. That if you eliminate crime, a lot of papers are going to go out of business. But I want to make a point about these athletes engaging in social justice issues. Are you kidding me? These are people that are making $28 million a year. What do they know about the people that are suffering on the street? It's a joke. So they have to be doing it because the big athletes want to improve their image and make more money. And I think they're pushing these athletic associations to do what they want them to do. They're afraid of that. They're afraid to be called racist. They're afraid to deal with real issues. It's race, and race is a bludgeon. And I feel bad for victims of racism, somebody who really is targeted because of race. They're going to get lost in this big fog of political racist debate, and I don't think they'll ever get justice the way they should get, because if someone's discriminated against, we should defend that person and fight against the racism. But today it's political racist, strategy. And these athletes making.
But those corporations, the ones that I referenced, the ones that are Georgia based, they're basically saying they believe that those elected Republicans in Georgia are racist. They're making a statement. And yet they're making a big
pandering
statement.
to a market. They're pandering to a market, I think.
But
no
don't they need? But don't they, as a corporation, don't they need more than just black consumers? How many tax breaks does Coca-Cola and or a Delta get from the state of Georgia? I mean, would it be wrong now for Georgia to come back and pull all the funding that they provide Delta? Would that be fair? Tit for tat?
Listen, this is all about money, and this is all about politics.
Yeah.
It's not about race. It's not about people being discriminated against. That's the worst part of this whole thing.
Paul Vellis.
Bruce, I just wanted to make the point. It's just not the black market, it's the youth market. I mean, when you saw that Pepsi commercial, they were playing to that broader youth market because they think that's where the pendulum is swinging. Yeah. And trust me, just as the NFL,
and that's where their market is.
That's right. But just as the NFL flipped, first they were anti-Kaepernick and then they were pro-Black Lives Matter. I mean, they'll flip back again if they feel that that's where the market is trending. So so clearly they're driven by that. But
Bruce,
so I think that.
Go ahead, Dave.
I was going to say, Bruce, I agree with the idea that racism is getting minimized. The main reason that happens is that you have so many of these cases where it's called out to be racism before the ink is even dry on the first word of starting to look into the investigation, and then you come to find out racism is not proven whatsoever. But the media never goes back and does a mea culpa, and so the narrative persists that, racism is everywhere, because they never go back and correct themselves and say, we were wrong for doing it. And then the problem is, like a guest said, the actual cases of racism get minimized because they just get overlooked. Because when everything is racism, nothing is racism.
Okay.
And
Dave,
one comment on the narrative. When you
We're
said,
out
how
of
does
time.
the narrative get created? It's
Dave,
because
we're out
the
of
fairness doctrine.
we're out of time. Call next week. Our thanks to Paul Vallis and Ray Hanania and
All right, buddy.
Anthony Anderson and Dave from Washington. Back with another segment. Don't go away. Unique thing happened, and hopefully our director will be able to figure it out as we move forward. But my clock just froze. So if I was a little bit late in coming back to say hello to everyone and welcoming Christine Chen to be on the Beltway, it's because my digital clock is frozen here in Chicago. So we'll just keep talking until the music comes in again. Christine, nice to have you with us.
Thank you so much. Great to be here.
Christine is the executive director of the Asian and Pacific Islanders American Vote. And one of the things that I wanted to talk with her about is obviously the news has been filled with stories of violent actions against Asian Americans over the last several months. And I wanted to talk a little bit about that. But I kind of want to broaden the subject out because there's not a lot of discussion. There's not a lot of coverage of Asian Americans as it relates to voting and voting patterns. And so I wanted to kind of have a course in Asian American voting. So Christine is the head of an organization that focuses on that. And Christine, let's begin by talking about, when we talk about Asians, who are we talking about?
Yeah, Asian American Pacific Islanders is a very broad term. It really encompasses everyone from East Asians, which you will know as like Chinese, Japanese, Korean, to Southeast Asians, which include like Vietnamese, Hmong, Thai, those from those countries, to South Asians, which is belonging to Indian, Pakistani, Bangladeshi, and then also Pacific Islanders. So, you know, for API Vote, we actually work with over 20 different ethnic communities currently, but it can actually span up to 50.
Okay. When you're talking about Asian American, again, when you're talking about the Hispanic communities, there are a variety of nationalities or countries represented when you're talking about Hispanics or Latinos. When you're talking about Asians, as you said, the numbers are very large. But is there a cooperative feeling amongst them when they come to the United States? Are they cooperative? Are they competitive? Are there groups there that really don't like each other? I mean, historically, we know that the Japanese and the Chinese have not been close over the centuries. What about now?
Right. So, you know, Asian American Pacific Islanders, currently we make up about 6.5% of the US population, and over 2/3 of our community are first generation immigrants. So what that means is that a lot of our population is coming from more of an understanding from countries, and the whole term of Asian American Pacific Islanders is really a term here within the United States where they lump us all together.
Mm-hmm.
But what we found quickly is that they do come together because very quickly you find out that many times we're lumped together under stereotypes of the model minority or being the other or this Americanized foreigner. And unfortunately, this past year with the rise of anti-Asian violence and hate, quickly people are really understanding how we as a community, it doesn't matter because everyone's lumping us together. But also in terms of issues and throughout history, and in terms of what we've seen in terms of the polling that we've done as a nonpartisan organization, is that there are issues that really resonate with this Asian American electorate. And so they do come together when it comes when you actually talk to them about issues.
Mm-hmm. And as it relates to the violence, do you think the media coverage of the violence is based on reality, or is it based on a favored media narrative at the moment? When many things get thrown into that hopper when the news media is looking at the issues.
Right now, if anything, we've been actually asking for this coverage because we've been dealing with this escalation of anti-Asian violence since last year. We had seen a lot of attacks, especially among our senior citizens. And so, for over 12 months, we've been really trying to, reach out to law enforcement, to the media, to elected officials to get them to understand that this was happening and it was escalating, and that we actually needed help and assistance in our communities. So right now, the focus, and unfortunately, because of what had transpired in Atlanta, Georgia, really has finally shown a highlight in terms of what is happening. And I'm very appreciative of your show as well as other media who is actually allowing us to
Hmm.
peel back and people make understand what is the Asian American Pacific Islander community.
If
What do
Yep.
your neighbors look like, and how are they feeling?
Let's take a look at what happened in Atlanta with the attack on the massage parlor there. Uh, when you heard the story, did you instantly think that it was an Asian hate crime? And then when the perpetrator there said that he was a sex addict, uh, did that separate you at all from your initial inclination?
Right. So, we work with our local partners in Atlanta. So immediately it was also finding out information from them. So as soon as we found out it was the Korean parlors, many of us actually know of those type of institutions, because that's actually very common in our community.
Mm-hmm.
It's just like going to massage envy, or to,
Right,
things that we see, right? And
right.
but so for them to actually go to three different ones in three different locations across the greater Atlanta area,
Hmm.
we immediately thought this was a hate crime, especially with what we've been experiencing this past year.
Okay. And when that happens, does the Korean community that in many cases are involved in that type of business, those types of businesses, and I don't know whether I'm accurate or not saying that, but of the groups that you mentioned, I think the either the Thai or the would be the most likely. Uh, does that make them? Are they upset about that their people are going into that type of business, or do they see it as a legitimate business within their business aspirations?
Yeah, you have to realize that is actually a legitimate business. I mean,
Oh
even the
yes,
mayor
right,
had noted that, right? So it's
right.
just like if you open a restaurant or things like that. So for us, we immediately was looking at, these are small business um, owners, and these are
Right.
low income wage workers that really needed assistance, on top of all the trauma that they're actually facing with all this anti-Asian violence.
But again, when the perpetrator here said that he was a sex addict, did it reduce in any way the fact that the women were Asian had maybe little to do with it?
No, because I think that's where this is where individuals or media is trying to separate the two, and many times targeting of women and Asian women is
Mm-hmm.
actually one and the same, and so
Mm-hmm.
it's it really is about how he perceived what these establishments were,
Mm-hmm.
versus in reality what they were.
You mentioned that many of your members are first generation to this country. How far do we go back? I mean, if we tried to turn back the clock to the very first group of Asians that came to this country, would it have been from China, or historically, can you give us any background on that?
Yeah, so actually the first Asian Americans were Filipino Americans,
Okay.
and then later on were Chinese Americans working the railroad, um and they were the first immigrants that came here in the 1700s and 1800s. So they were here from the beginning of time when we were building this United States and this nation and its infrastructure. Then throughout time, what we've seen in terms of history of where we've continued to face different hardships and barriers in terms of becoming truly recognized as Americans, is like the incarceration of Japanese Americans during World War II, in terms of the racial profiling there. And then, I'm from the Midwest. I'm from Ohio, and so
Mhm.
I remember in the '80s when we were looking at the hate crime of Vincent Chin. This was during the time period when the auto industry was not doing well economically here in the United States, and so two auto workers saw Vincent Chin as a Chinese American, but they actually thought of him as Japanese and saying that you're taking away our jobs, and then ultimately killed him in the Michigan area.
Christine,
And then also
we've got to pause
Hi,
for a
I'm Dr.
moment. Bruce DuMont back in Evanston, Illinois. We're talking with Christine Chen. And Christine, from a political standpoint, one of the documents that was sent to me by your associates suggested that you were probably the deciding factor in the most recent presidential election. When I say you, I mean your group, your
right.
group
So
of Americans.
Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders were part of also a factor in terms of who won the elections in a lot of the battleground states. A lot of people don't realize that we're actually one of the fastest growing segments of eligible voters. So this past year, more than 11 million were able to vote in 2020, making up 5% of the nation's eligible voters,
Mhm.
but even more so in terms of when you look at the states in itself. So for instance, there's a lot of tension looking in terms of Georgia. So Georgia, in terms of their population in the last decade, increased by over 49%. And then also no group in Georgia relied on early mail voting more than API voters. So 85% of API voters also cast our vote in Georgia early during the election period. And we actually overperformed more than any other demographic.
And what can you tell us about the mix between Republican voters and Democratic voters within your study group?
So
Did they lean one way?
So traditionally in the past, it used to be a third Democrat, a third Republican, a third independent. The last decade or so, you saw a lot of Asian Americans actually trend Democrat. A lot of it is also based on the issues that the candidates stand for. But even then, there's this year, even though you have majority of those who are leaning Democrat, there are some slight differences. So for instance, Vietnamese Americans and Filipino Americans trend to be a little bit more conservative. Indian Americans, Japanese Americans tend to be a lot more progressive.
Mhm.
So, but one thing that we did see is also Chinese Americans. Out of all the Asian ethnic groups, they actually, the majority are identifying as independent.
And is the majority of your, when I say your group, when we're talking about the collective community that you represent, I think primarily West Coast, but not exclusively West Coast?
No, so I think that's what people used to think is like
Okay.
that Asian Americans were only on the East and West Coast. But now you've seen tremendous growth. We're in large numbers in Texas, New York, Washington, Florida, Virginia. These are part of the top 10 states where we actually reside in. So, and then you saw this past decade growth in North Carolina, Georgia, Arizona, Nevada. And these are places where the demographics are changing, and then also in terms of the elections. And so I would take like Virginia and Nevada for an example. Both Democrats and Republicans the last decade have been aggressively trying to reach out and engage Asian American voters because they realize at the local level they are making a difference in terms of the elections, swinging either way depending on the candidates.
Many groups or political groups, they carry some albatross around their neck, and I'm talking about ethnic groups in the United States. I won't get into it, but again, a lot of negative connotations. When I think of Asian Americans, I think they're smart, they're hardworking, and they're very family oriented, all positive. Is that a fair assessment of the plus side of at least the image of Asian Americans?
Yeah, I would say that's actually one of the model minority myths that has been plaguing our community for quite a
So
long
it's a
time.
myth, a myth.
Yes, well, because we are as diverse as other Americans here in
Uh-huh.
the United States, right?
Right.
We all come from various different economic situations, education situations, and because we're seen as being highly successful, or because our cultural values or upbringing are so quote unquote more superior, then it actually silences the reality that we actually are facing different difficulties or different racism or are not or do not have access to certain resources. And for instance, Asian American seniors, women actually have the highest rate of the suicide rate, and a
Oh,
lot of people don't even know about that.
no.
Or in New
Why
York,
why
one of the
why do you
largest.
why do you think that is?
Unfortunately, I'm not an expert in terms of that area, but these are like some demographics that we're all learning about as this as more research, and we're actually capturing data about this community. I think that's part of the problem, is that for the longest time we're always seen as the other. In polling data and research, you always see white, black, Latino, and then you have other. And so it's only when we're starting to capture data about the Asian American community that we're learning about these things about our communities in itself.
Is it true that they tend to uh, congregate more amongst themselves? Are they? I have heard, again, this is anecdotal, that many businesses that are owned by Indians or Pakistanis or Koreans, that if they are going to sell those businesses, they try to sell those businesses to someone else from their nationality group. Is there any truth to that at all?
I would not say that. I think it goes back to different generations. When you first come here, you're going to naturally gravitate to people that you know and have been working with, right? But then after that, in terms of business is business, you're going to look into who you want to sell to based on the values and what is the priority of that particular person. I also know in terms of even, working and living in different communities. I know I'm a second generation Chinese American. I know my parents would wish that I had learned Chinese American more efficiently, but unfortunately I didn't. So it goes back to
we are out of time. I thank you very much. Forgive me for maybe some pretty dumb questions, but Christina Chen, thank you very much from the American, Asian, and Pacific Islanders vote in Chicago. I'm Bruce DuMont. Thanks very much.